Now to the evolution of translation studies. Translation studies did not come into their own until relatively recently. Some say that academic interest and theoretical thinking about translation is a tale as old as time. In this sense, translation studies started thousands of years ago. Chesterman describes the evolution of theoretical thinking about translation in 8 stages. Here we see his 8-stage model. You see these stages 1 to 8, when they began, and also a metaphor linking to this particular stage. For more information of this, turn to page 136 in Understanding Translation. Stage 1. The earliest stages of translation theory began around 1000 BC, and the norm then was to transfer the meaning of words. To translate is derived from the Latin transfer, which means to transfer or to carry across. So the meaning of words will carry it over from one text to another. For this reason, the translation process became an act of taking the meaning of units, or words, from one text in one language and rebuilding them in another language. The second stage, stage 2. The second stage of translation theory began approximately around the 4th century, where a new focal point was presented, and this was to translate without altering the meaning of the source text, meaning staying as close as possible to the source text. This approach was mainly important when translating Bibles, as one should not alter the Word of God. Furthermore, it is important to note that the norm was to use direct translation, but only in cases where it made sense semantically. This second stage introduced the groundwork for the 3-term taxonomy. Stage 3. The third stage emerged during the Renaissance. At this time, translation of Bibles grew less dominant, and that made way for new kinds of translation. This meant that the approach to translation became less source-oriented and instead developed into a free style, as translators tried to imitate the creative measure that was taken to write the original text. This can be seen in translation of ancient Greek literature, as well as the German translation of the Bible that Martin Luther did. Stage 4. In the 19th century, where the 4th stage emerged and changed the previous understanding of translation norms. Scholars did not favor a target-oriented approach, neither did they favor the earlier preferred literal translation. They began to experiment with approaches that purposely created a sense of foreignness in the target text, and so forming new literature, instead of just copying or imitating as it was previously done. 2 approaches to note are Verfremdung and Entfremdung. Turn to page 141 for more information. These approaches are chosen based on whether you want a target text-oriented translation or a source text-oriented translation. Now, there are 2 approaches to choose from. Stage 5. This next stage of the translation evolution began around the middle part of the 20th century. As opposed to the literary focus in previous stages, scholars now started to focus more on the non-literary and the more linguistic aspects of translation. Because of the newly scientific and rule-seeking approach, scholars became influenced to see translation as a rule-based process of linguistic decoding and recoding. And in this stage, equivalence became a notion that was a very important tool for translators. It became important to have a relation of equal value between 2 texts. Because of this rule-based approach, mechanical translation emerged, and researchers sought to program computers to produce well-translated texts without humans intervening in the process. Stage 6. At this point in the evolution of translation studies, translation is now considered a separate discipline, though it still overlaps with linguistics and other disciplines in that category. Now scholars start to analyze what the meaning and the effect of text look like in certain situations. They would use pragmatics and text linguistics in these studies. Then a question was raised: how does translated text function? Scholars rejected the notion of equivalence completely, and it was swapped for target text functionality, which is referred to as functional translation. Stage 7. During the 70s, Israeli and Belgian scholars came up with what they called the new paradigm. Previously, translation studies were about figuring out and establishing what translators ought to do when translating, but now the scholars became more interested in observing what went on in the act of translating. The translator became a social agent, and the translating norms became defined as performance instructions, which had to be appropriate for the particular translation situation. This was called descriptive translation studies, and would specify what was tolerated and what was not permitted when translating. Finally, Stage 8. This final stage may have a long history, but it only became visible during the 80s and 90s, when there was a growing interest around what translators was... Fuck this shit, I'm not doing this again. When there was a growing interest around what translators were thinking while in the process of translating. This new interest was influenced by the latest developments in the field of cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics. Furthermore, literary scholars experienced a growing tendency to look at cultural studies and apply them to their translation studies to help them form a deeper understanding of the material. And so, these were the 8 stages of translation studies, aka translation studies through the ages. Bye.